こんにちは、プレイヤーワンさん。ゲーミングヒストリークラブへようこそ。私の名前はギャビです。
Konnichiwa, watashi wa JP desu. Regardless of your age or video game niche, the odds of you not having been exposed to Japanese video games is very, very slim. And for good reason, we owe much to our Far East brethren for making video games what they are today. So, let us explore how Japan influenced video games. So, Player One, first of all, you might remember that we promised you, in front of a certain angry video game nerd, to give you the details of how to win the Gaming History Club Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES, or SNES. So, stay tuned until the end of this episode where we'll give you all the details that you need to find out how to win our super hot SNES. But anyway, now let's get to the episode. So, Gavi, I noticed in the artwork there's a certain mysterious kanji floating around. What is that all about?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, if you probably ask ChatGPT what that means, it's not going to be that mysterious anymore. But anyway, it stands for Wabi Sabi. So, Wabi Sabi is developed out of the aesthetic philosophy of Cha no Yu, the tea ceremony, in the 15th century Japan. So, Wabi Sabi is an aesthetic that finds beauty in things that are imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. So, taken from the Japanese word wabi, which translates to less is more, and sabi, which means attentive melancholy, wabi sabi refers to an awareness of the transient nature of earthly things and a corresponding pleasure in the things that bear the mark of this impermanence.
Yeah, so if we wanted to sum it up and get a little bit lazy about it, it's kind of like the beautiful things in what we would consider not immediately beautiful.
Yeah, in something that is imperfect. So, why do we actually start by talking about this? Because we love the Japanese philosophy as well as video games, which I guess a lot of the Japanese culture and philosophy actually portrayed in video games quite a lot as well.
Well, if you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, we like video games. That's why we have a podcast dedicated to the history of video games. And so naturally, we will have been having so much Japanese influence in our childhood. Like, I don't even remember any games that like weren't Japanese from my childhood, apart from one, of course, which is Flashback, which was a really good game. But yeah, of course, we're like full of Japanese culture and like upbringing. Yeah, animes, manga, all kinds of like concepts and terms like unagi, of course, from Friends,
Okay, yeah.
ikigai, or like how to find your true calling in life, which
Mm-hmm.
I think was a mixture of like what you love to do, what you can do well, what the world needs, and what you can make money off. And then if you find that one thing that fits all of those things, that is your ikigai, I believe. But I could be a little bit wrong, but I think I've summarized it pretty well there. But yeah, we're full of Japanese little tidbits, aren't we? And yeah, wabi sabi is definitely one of like the cooler ones as well. Yeah. Although I'll be honest, I forget the words, but I always remember the imagery of like the broken pot that is fixed with like the gold dust to fill in the cracks. That's usually how I remember the beautiful things and things not beautiful, I guess. So, Gabby, when thinking about my own childhood and just my favorite games in general, and you try and think about all of the ones that are Japanese, I realized that, like, well, most of them probably are actually Japanese.
Mm,
And
makes sense.
it would be easier to think of the ones that aren't, basically, because the list is going to be slimmer for sure.
You mean basically when you look into the list, most of them will be Japanese, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
Mm.
by far. I mean, I don't want to play the silly game of like listing all of the things that are Japanese, but like, let's should we have a quick go anyway? Mario, Zelda, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Metal Gear Solid, Pokemon,
Yes.
um, ah,
Ape Escape for me,
yeah,
definitely.
Animal
So,
Crossing.
did you actually play Animal Crossing? I thought you didn't really get into that.
No, but you're obsessed with it,
Ah,
so
yeah, that's
mm,
true. Yeah. Can you blame me though?
yeah. Anyway, this is going to be a very, very long game if we play this.
Yep, true.
But rest assured, yes, there's so many Japanese games, right? It's incredible. So, thankfully, we've visited the history of Nintendo back in 2023, as well as the Game Boy. because it's easy to accidentally gloss over just how much impact Japan has had as a whole on games, and it certainly wasn't just Nintendo, right?
Yeah.
So Nintendo's 8-bit NES and the 16-bit SNES generation of home consoles, they combined sold 111 million units worldwide, okay? And that is more than double the sales of Nintendo's biggest competitor at the time, the two Sega consoles, the Master System and the Mega Drive. But also Nintendo's iconic handheld console, the Game Boy, of course, it totally eclipsed all of its competitors in sales. It was outselling the Sega Game Gear sixfold. So Nintendo completely dominated for a decade and starting in the mid 80s, okay? So we have decided to actually balance the equation a little bit by glossing over Nintendo for a change. But don't worry, we have two other episodes, Player One, dedicated entirely to Nintendo, and also the Game Boy, so you can listen to those as well if you don't want to miss out on all that fun.
Yeah, definitely, because we actually delve deeper into like Nintendo itself in those two episodes, right?
Yeah, I mean, the company is more than 100 years old. There is a lot to unpack here if
Yeah.
we include Nintendo.
Definitely. But yeah, one thing that has become super apparent in our research is that actually US and Japan are truly yin and yang of video games. Although it was in the US where the first video game arcade cabinet and home console were born in 1972, those games did not have much artistic merit beyond primal, simple, Pong like, full of lines and dots kind of games.
Yes, Pong clones. It was full of Pong clones.
Yeah, you're right. Everything looked like Pong and played like it too, somehow, with only like minor variations, notably early racing games, and of course in the university labs with early mainframe computer pioneers. There were no characters, only white square blobs, no music, certainly there was no plot, story, or even like scrolling screens. Much of the deeper art elements came from games made in Japan, most importantly with and after the release of a game that often represents video games as a whole in 1978.
Yeah, but stay tuned. We're going to get into that a little bit later.
Yeah, that's true. Foreshadowing much.
Yes, big foreshadowing.
But yeah, Japan was already well known for making mechanical and electromechanical games too. They were certainly no stranger to making fun arcade games before the rise of video games in the arcades.
Yeah, something what I found was really interesting, and it seems really ironic to me. So, the US's first big major video game manufacturer, Atari, their identity and symbolism was fully inspired by Japan's influence and notoriety for making cutting edge arcade games. So, the name Atari actually comes from the Japanese board game Go. In Go, the word Atari is a term similar to check in chess, if you will. So it means a piece or a group of pieces is about to be captured, essentially. Nolan Bushnell, founder of Atari, who was inspired to make a video game arcade cabinet from his exposure to them whilst he was working on maintaining electromechanical arcade games in his youth, was well aware of Japanese technology, and when naming his company, he chose a Japanese style vibe to give his company, to give it that cutting edge, tech forward identity, if you will. Even the iconic Atari logo seems to be shaped as a nod to Mount Fuji.
Yeah, and while on the other hand, the Japanese were inspired by much of American media too, with Donkey Kong and Mario, for example, clearly inspired by the Hollywood movies like King Kong, or Mario the Italian plumber coming to save a princess. Even Zelda was inspired by a mix of Western folklore and fantasy like Lord of the Rings kind of vibe, and the sword of Excalibur serving as an archetype for the Master Sword. But American media was certainly not the only influencing factors. Shigeru Miyamoto was inspired by the landscapes, hillsides, and caves of his hometown of Sonobe. This is what we mean, really, with the US and Japan clearly influencing and bouncing off each other to create better and more innovative games since the very beginning. It is impossible to imagine video games being what they are today without either of these far west and far east influences coming together to create a truly unique experience that blends gaming with artistry.
So, how did Japan become a leader in video game development, and what led to it? Well, a good time to start when asking such a profound question is, as many of our longtime listeners probably suspect, immediately after the Second World War.
It's always the war.
It's always the war when it comes to video games. But for good reason, right? So there were many technologies that came out of World War II, and it certainly wasn't just computer related things either. So we got things like flu vaccines, antibiotics, jet engines, blood plasma transfusion, and radar, to mention just a few of these technologies. Another invention was, of course, the atomic bomb. Developed in secret in what was known as the Manhattan Project, the electronics division lead, William Higginbotham, whose team created the ignition device for the atomic bomb, would later create one of the very first video games in 1958 as part of a government funded science exhibition. The game was called Tennis for Two, and it was basically the original Pong way before the commercial public would ever lay hands on a video game at the arcades. But, unlike the US, Japan was recovering from the dramatic shock of having two atomic bombs attack Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And while we won't be getting into the specifics here, as fascinating and relevant as they actually are to how Japan became a leader in video games, you gotta just know one thing. Japan's post-World War II recovery is one of the most impressive economic turnarounds in history.
Yes, Japan became a leader in technology and manufacturing during the 1950s and 1970s. They focus on high quality production and following the continuous improvement philosophy known as Kaizen. And several large Japanese companies were leading technological innovation, like Sony, Panasonic, Toyota, Honda, in the electronics, consumer goods, and automotive industries. This economic boom for Japan led to Japanese people gaining a relatively good amount of exposable income. And as such, after work, entertainment activities flourished once again, including mechanical and electromechanical arcade games. One of those companies creating electromechanical games was Sega.
Yeah, so Sega's history is wild, and I didn't know this, but they actually started off as an American company. So Sega started in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1940 during the Second World War. And back then it wasn't named Sega just yet, though. It was actually known as Standard Games, but I'm just going to call them Sega just to keep it a little bit easy. Um, Sega started off by providing coin operated amusement machines, basically slot machines, to US military bases to provide entertainment to stationed soldiers who didn't have much else to do back in those boring days before video games. The company would move to Tokyo in 1951 to avoid the US ban on slot machines in Hawaii. The company would undergo several mergers until merging with a company called Rosen Enterprises, and by 1964 it would be renamed to Sega as we know them today, and at this time it became an official Japanese company headquartered in Tokyo. So Sega would move away from focusing exclusively on leasing slot machines to US military bases and instead on coin operated amusement machines, importing products like jukeboxes, pinball machines made by Williams, as well as gun games made by Midway. And here we can already see how Japanese arcade scene was being populated with very familiar names, Sega, Midway, and Williams. These are all companies that would later capitalize on the video game arcade scene that would arise just a decade later. In 1966, Sega released their first self manufactured arcade game, an electromechanical game called Periscope, a shooting submarine simulator, which became very successful not only in Japan but also in Europe and in the US. It was so popular, in fact, that it would popularize the use of one American quarter in order to play one game in the US. Sega would continue to create several of its own arcade machines throughout the 70s, and it would become the only home console manufacturer to give Nintendo at least somewhat of a competition later during the Bit Wars.
So that was Sega, but for now, let's move on from talking about nations and companies. Let's talk about Tomohiro Nishikado, the legendary video game developer, engineer, and innovator who gave birth to the golden age of arcade games. A true gaming history legend.
Oh, yes, definitely, a hero. Right up there with William Higginbotham and Slug.
And Slug,
And
definitely.
Sluggers.
Yep. So Nishikado was a protege since childhood, carrying out his own science experiments and getting into electronics at school where he built radios and amplifiers. He graduated from Tokyo Denki University with a degree in engineering. His career in arcade games started when he joined Taito and developed the electromechanical target shooting games Skyfighter 1 and 2 that were released in 1971, just 1 year before Pong would be released in the US. So Nishikado's bosses at Taito saw that TTL, transistor logic, the predecessor of the microprocessor, was the future for video game development, and they assigned Nishikado, being the only engineer employed at Taito with knowledge of TTL, to investigate the technology to be used in their future video games. So, Nishikado began working on video game arcade cabinets the same year as Pong released in 1972, and he started reverse engineering the game. His first arcade video game was simply called Soccer, released in November 1973. It's in a sense similar to Pong, but with a green background instead of black and with goals on each side, basically to portray a soccer field. The game also allowed each player to control one regular player and a goalkeeper. Nishikado actually considers Soccer to be the first original Japanese made video game, being more than just a Pong clone like Sega's Pongtron or Taito's Alapong. It may not sound like much, but it is actually quite the achievement though to reverse engineer Pong and create a game that builds on top of the game mechanics and creates something that's just more than just a clone, basically, creating something more creative and just a more clear concept with soccer.
Yeah, it's there's more going on here, so it's more representative of what it's supposed to be. Pong is very like what's it supposed to be? Is it like some call it like tennis, I guess, or like
Yeah, ping pong,
I mean, but that, even that's stretching the imagination, right? I
very
mean,
true.
yeah, soccer had a green background instead of black, which actually must have took like a fair little bit of graphics
Mm,
because they use black a lot just because it's easier on the resources, right? You had two goals on either side, but I think the most advanced part is that the player could control two players,
yeah.
right? So the regular soccer it sounds so weird saying soccer instead of football for us, right? Can we just yeah? But the game's called soccer, so yeah. And a goalkeeper. So that was really cool. Like one player controlling two separate in-game characters. Yeah. And I think that's what it means. So he considers that to be the first Japanese video game that was not just a Pong clone. It
Yeah.
was doing more than that, and it was his own game. But Nishikado did a lot of stuff. So actually, just 7 months later, Nishikado would release his next game, Basketball. And don't we miss when games had simple, straightforward, no nonsense names?
I know, right? You should have called like all first person shooter game to be like gun.
Yes. Or Adventure, which was actually a game by Atari later. But
Very true.
we're getting off track. Anyway, bored with the simple character controlled shapes of previous video games, Nishikado envisioned a game that again built on top of the Pong formula, but with the shapes rearranged to make for more visually appealing objects and characters in the game, such as the basketball hoops in Basketball. Basketball became the earliest use of character sprites to represent human player characters in a video game. Let me just repeat that. It was the first to use character sprites to represent human player characters. And it was also the first Japanese game to be licensed to be released in North America. Originally a deal with Atari, but eventually being licensed to Midway instead for release in North America. And then Nishikado in 1974 releases another game called Speed Race, and this introduced vertical scrolling to video games, a technique used countless of times in 2D games later, and well, at a push even introducing an entire genre of video games, yeah, side-scrollers, right? And of course, he also made Western Gun, also known as Gunfight in the US, the first game to depict player versus player violence and to have dual stick controls, as a matter of fact, as well as being the first video game cabinet to use that TTL logic to run the game. But we covered this game thoroughly in our previous remakes and remasters episode, so again we'll be glossing over the history of this really fascinating and cutting edge tech game for now.
But of course, the game that would become Nishikado's legacy for the video game world would start the golden age of video games. Inspired by War of the Worlds and Star Wars, as well as games such as Breakout and Gunfight, Nishikado wanted to create a game that gave the player a sense of tension and achievement by destroying enemies one at a time. He wanted to elevate how video games could interact with the player, such as with enemies responding to how the player was playing the game, firing back at clever moments, and a legendary game over screen that appeared when the enemies killed the player rather than an arbitrary timer running out, which many games around that time and before that actually had.
Yeah, what else did this game do? I believe we've played this game before, Player One, so let's see at what point you actually realize what game it is that we're talking about, if you haven't already figured it out. It was the first fixed shooter video game, and it set a template for the shoot 'em up genre. It was the first game to save high scores. It revolutionized music in gaming by featuring music and sound effects directly relating to the player's actions and increasing in tempo as the game gets harder. It was the first to have multiple enemies that could fire back at the player. It was the first to have multiple lives. It was the first where the player has to repel hordes of enemies and can take cover from enemy fire and use destructible barriers. It shifted games from bars and amusement arcades to more mainstream locations such as restaurants, department stores, movie theaters, bowling alleys, convenience stores, laundromats, gas stations, supermarkets, airports. Even the dentist and doctor's offices would sometimes have this video game arcade cabinet.
Why do we not have an arcade cabinet in our dentist office?
It's because Nishikado stopped making games for us.
Oh, boo.
An arcade machine's owner could make up for the cost of the machine in under a month, and sometimes even in as little as 1 week.
I mean, this game sounds phenomenal.
It even served as many future game developers' introduction into video games, including Shigeru Miyamoto, Hideo Kojima, John Romero, and John Carmack. It was the best-selling and highest-grossing game ever at the time, and I'm gonna give some figures to back myself up here. And I've adjusted the currency for inflation, just to make it sound even more grandiose, by the way. So by the end of 1978, 100,000 machines were installed and $3 billion were grossed from them. It had 8 million daily players in Japan, with a daily revenue peaking at $54 million. It was struggling to keep up with demand, so they licensed Midway to distribute the arcade machines overseas, and by 1982, this game had grossed over $13 billion single-handedly.
Yeah, just to be clear, the reason we are listing all of its achievement first is to fully highlight just how important and big this Japanese game was, becoming the first big blockbuster video game hit and easily outshining what came before that. And if you haven't guessed it by now, the game was Space Invaders. If any game is a testament to how Japan has influenced video games, perhaps no other game was as important as Tomohiro Nishikado's Space Invaders. And yeah, I would definitely agree to that.
Yeah, and no other man was as important to Japan's influence in video games as Tomohiro Nishikado. Japanese arcade games would become trendsetters in much of the finer elements of video games we've discussed before, but they also pushed video games graphically. So let's take a look at some other arcade games that came out during the golden age of arcade games after Space Invaders finally kicks it into gear. So we got Galaxian, developed by Katsunori Hawano, published by Namco, and released in 1979. So this one really heavily improved on graphics and the interactivity that was introduced in Space Invaders. The game was the first to use RGB color schemes, able to create multicolored and animated sprites, such as the ships, enemies, and explosions happening in-game. So while Space Invaders had blocky colors, objects in Galaxian had a very crisp and detailed, colorful look in comparison. It was an absolute thing of beauty, and I remember pointing this arcade game out to you when we were like in the arcades ourselves, and we didn't really have that connection yet to where it was. But I do remember like saying to you like, "Wow, look at this! This is 1979." I was like completely flabbergasted by it, honestly. Galaxian also introduced enemies that had different personalities and would act differently from each other. So, for example, you have one enemy type that has like a kamikaze behavior where, it just dive bombs towards the player, for example.
Yeah, speaking of enemies with different personalities, I don't think we can avoid talking about Pac Man in this episode. So yeah, Pac Man, also made by Namco, was released the following year in 1980. It was designed by Toru Iwatani and a 9-man team. The game set the stage for a staple of video games, especially in Japan, by introducing a playable mascot. It moved away from the stereotypical themes such as space, shooting, and racing. Iwatani's idea envisioned during development creating a game that would attract female and couples audiences. If you remember in our old episodes, basically, we talk about how Pac Man was inspired by the fact that women like eating. So they created this Pac Man mascot who eats all of the dots. And yeah, they also have the famous ghost characters programmed to have their own personalities. So each of the ghosts actually have a name which gives a hint to their own strategy to track down Pac-Man, giving the ghost deterministic AI reacting to players' action. Just to remind you, so we have Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and Clyde. Blinky gives direct chase to Pac-Man. Pinky and Inky try to position themselves in front of Pac-Man, usually by cornering him. And Clyde will switch between chasing Pac Man and fleeing from him. But yeah, it was the first game to feature a cutscene, which made for a refreshing interlude between levels.
Yeah, I think we could summarize Pac-Man by saying like, hey, look, cutscenes between levels, definitely pioneering that. I mean, cutscenes are key, isn't it, to like storytelling, narrative, and just gluing a game together in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, and although in Pac Man the cutscenes were really simple, and you can't really say it's like a video cutscene per se, but it did have like a cutscene between levels.
Yeah, but I mean, compared to having nothing at all, it
Mm.
is a world of difference at the same time. And then lastly, of course, also the fact that like, yeah, it's not a space shooter or like a racing game. Again, this is just something funny. You play as this cute little mascot, Pac-Man. You just go around eating dots, fleeing away from cute little ghosts. It gives you much more of that classy, video game vibe a little bit.
Definitely.
Especially that Japanese influence. It really starts to come out here with like mascots, especially, right?
Yeah, and speaking of mascot, by the way, I mean, I know that we don't really want to deep dive into Nintendo, but we can't completely ignore Nintendo in this episode. Um, Donkey Kong is released by Nintendo in 1981, and it was designed by first-time video game designer Shigeru Miyamoto, who would eventually become producer and game director for Nintendo. I mean, he's the Mr. Nintendo man himself.
He is the Mr. Nintendo man, yeah.
Yeah, and he also spawned most famously Mario and Zelda games, which just makes sense. But Donkey Kong was Nintendo's response to Namco's Pac Man in an attempt to break into the American market. They'd drawn inspiration from Beauty and the Beast, Popeye, and King Kong to try to appeal to American audiences. They broke new ground by using graphics as a means of characterization, including using cutscenes to advance the game's overarching plot. They also pioneered the platform game genre before the term existed. Remember, this was before Mario. So Donkey Kong's success positioned Nintendo for global market dominance starting from 1981 until the mid 90s, when players' home became the primary location for consuming games.
Yeah, so one of Japan's most impactful contributions was the global appeal of its video games, and it did this by incorporating these cute, lovely mascots that came out of the emerging kawaii culture in Japan. So, if we look at brands like Hello Kitty, for example, they embrace something what is known as mukokuseki, which can be described as the marketing of Japanese brands towards non Japanese audiences by having a cosmopolitan, stateless, or nationless flair to them. Some might say odorless. It just appeals globally. And while we highlighted how Japan was inspired by Western media like Hollywood movies, cartoons, and fantasy books, in Chris Kohler's book Power Up, How Japanese Video Games Gave the World an Extra Life, he explained that the notion of growing up with picture books, comic books, and chapter books with illustrations are looked down on in the Western world, perceived as something childish, while in Japan, Shikaku Sedai, which is a phrase of visual generation or living immersed in anime and manga, actually privileged the image as a method of communication. This particular outlook brought Japan's video games to be more daring to begin with, when the West viewed this at first as something that might not be as popular outside of Japan whatsoever. So when the video game market crashed in America in 1983, it was due to a large amount of cheap and low quality games being made for the Atari 2600 home console, with consumers having no reliable source to easily know what games were good or bad, with the majority of them being very, very bad. Nobody wanted to buy video games anymore. Games were being sold for mere cents, and stores actually struggled to recover the money that they lost from buying the games full price in the first place. Infamously, the movie tie-in game E.T. the Extraterrestrial was made in just 6 weeks' time to make the Christmas period and coincide with the hype for the Steven Spielberg blockbuster movie. It was blamed for single-handedly giving the death blow to the industry, with its unused Atari cartridges being dumped in a landfill in New Mexico, something which was only thought to be a rumor for like a long time until it turned out, no, this actually happened, they actually did this. Although E.T. shouldn't only be blamed for the crash itself, although it is often like blamed for it.
No, I get it though. I mean, it was bad, and we all know it was bad. But I think there are so many other bad games that were also responsible. But I think E.T. is just becoming like the prime example.
Yes, the prime example. That's a good way of putting it, yeah. See, here we are, all these Japanese games really bringing video games to like the cutting edge of technology with like these brilliant story things and mascots happening and fun charm. And then there's like Atari making ET, thanks guys, crushing the entire market. Interesting to note, however, that in Japan, video games still thrived, and in Japan, the video game crash is actually more commonly referred to as the Atari crash, apparently. And we're not going to mention Europe because, to be quite honest with you, we weren't really making video games just yet here. Only a little bit.
I feel like we will never be able to avoid talking about Nintendo when talking about Japanese video games, by the way, because it was the Famicom that brought video games back to America. And Japanese video game consoles and games single handedly kept gaming alive in America. While the Famicom was released in Japan in 1983, its redesigned version for the international market, named Nintendo Entertainment System, was released in 1985 and 86 worldwide. In Chris Kohler's book that JP mentioned before, Power Up, Chris explained that American companies like Atari tried to compete, but American video games just could not stand up to games like Nintendo's Super Mario Bros. Even today, thanks mostly to the early influence of Japanese quote unquote bizarre cartoon games, a great many successful games in the US are actually Japanese. In their January 2002 issue, editors of the popular video game magazine Electronic Gaming Monthly voted for their favorite 100 games of all times. So, let me list it out, right? Out of the 100 games listed, 86 had recognizable, distinct characters. 78 of them had a full story or story elements. 38 of them were role playing games built entirely around a story progression, and 93 out of 100 were Japanese in origin.
Yeah, just let that sink in. Like in 2002, this big games magazine, they listed the 100 of their favorite games ever. 93 of them were Japanese. 93 of them. I've been thinking like Super Nintendo was my first console, right? I remember one game that I liked that wasn't Japanese. I mean, I liked all the games, but when I think about my favorites, there was one game, Flashback, that is not Japanese. Every single other game I really enjoyed playing, Street Fighter, Donkey Kong, Mario, Zelda, they're all Japanese. They're all Japanese, apart from Flashback. Japanese video games completely owned the home console market worldwide for 3 entire generations, if you think about it. So, starting with Nintendo and Sega's consoles from the mid 80s, the third generation of home consoles, as it's formally known, or the 8-bit generation, and lasting until the fifth generation of consoles, which was dominated largely by Nintendo's 64 and even more so by the PlayStation 1. It wasn't until the sixth generation of home consoles, with Microsoft's first entrance into the video game console market in 2001 with the Xbox, that America would have another successful game console made in the US. 3 whole generations of Japan-dominated home consoles worldwide.
But of course, it wasn't just the console themselves though. Third-party developers largely contributed to the success of Japanese games as well, with big household names including Capcom, Konami, and Square Enix, to name a few that we haven't yet mentioned. And to be fair, they do deserve their own episode, I feel like. But yeah, together with anime and manga, Japanese culture came to worldwide recognition through video games in the 80s and the 90s, with kawaii culture that we mentioned before, quirky mascots like Kirby, and historic Japanese tropes like shinobi ninjas and samurai, and of course, JP's favorite, Power Rangers.
It's Morphin time.
Yes, it's Morphin time indeed.
If we were to attempt to summarize Japanese video game design philosophy, it would be with number one, innovation in genres. So we've got JRPGs, for example, we got visual novels, rhythm games, stealth games, platformers, as well as many more. Second, I think the artistry, especially when it comes to the storytelling and the deep narratives, they found a lot in the early classics, so like Final Fantasy, for example, or Chrono Trigger. As well with artistry, though, I feel like it's the great way that they can make some fantastic music that really stands out, and I can recite from the top of my head quite easily. And third and lastly, I think a gameplay first mentality, focusing on the fun of the game mechanics and the gameplay rather than just the pure eye candy of the cutting edge technology of the time. But there is a lot more we could talk about and uncover when it comes to Japan. It has so many rabbit holes to offer and they're deep and would probably make this episode way too long though. So we have things like the Bid Wars, for example, the JRPGs we mentioned, but even like Tamagotchis, which isn't perhaps strictly speaking a video game, but I feel like it does actually deserve to be mentioned at some point. And gacha games, of course, visual novels, dating sims. But don't worry, Player One, we're gonna uncover all of this in future episodes too. But yeah, so don't worry if you haven't heard some of these like things because we're just waiting for the right time. So, Player One, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And now, as promised, if you are game to win our Gaming History Club SNES, what you need to do is the following. Number one, let us know why you deserve to win the SNES in particular. And number two, tell us what is your favorite Gaming History Club episode and why. And you can do so by unleashing your inner creative genius. You can send us a voice message, you can draw us a picture, or make us a spreadsheet about why you deserve the SNES, whatever it takes to win it. And you can send that in to us by email to snes@gaminghistory.club. If you're hearing this for the first time, well, then you can take it a little bit easy. The competition will close on the 31st of May, and the winner announced in our episode on the 18th of June. So get creative. And for more details, you can check out our website, gaminghistory.club/SNES.
Yeah, what other topics would you like to hear, Player One? I'm sure this episode gave you plenty of ideas what history we should uncover next. Let us know what you think by dropping us a message on our website, gaminghistory.club. New episodes of Gaming History Club are released every other Wednesday, so make sure you subscribe and follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Gaming History Club.
Come back in a couple of weeks, Player One, when we peel off another layer of Japanese video games and how love turned into a coded activity as we explore the history of dating sims. See ya.